Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started now. So welcome to the DNL Buildings and Urban Planning panel. I think we've got a great selection of different perspectives on urban planning and building, and judging by who's in the room as well, some great perspectives outside of the panelists themselves. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes of these discussions. So I'm not going to introduce everybody with a formal bio, but I will tell you why I asked each of these people to be here today. So, and I'll go, I guess, in order from Sharon, if you want to just wave to everybody. So Sharon Cave has a lot of expertise when it comes to building LEED certified buildings and energy efficiency across a broad spectrum of building sizes and types. So I wanted to make sure there was an institutional, a commercial type of perspective, as well as heritage tiny homes and net zero homes and some other type of uses like that. So Sharon brings the larger buildings perspective, and she's done some really exciting projects that she'll tell you about from that. And next to Sharon, we have Michael Philpott. So Michael is a heritage officer with the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland Labrador, and he's a big advocate of the reuse of heritage stock instead of tearing them down, releasing all of that energy and building up new buildings. So, which in Newfoundland and Labrador, where we have a ton of buildings that are, 100, 200 years old, we have a beautiful stock of heritage resources, and they are always in danger of being knocked down in favor of something else on the footprint of the building lot. So he's a big advocate for keeping those. Then we have Jess Puddister, who helped us get the tiny home regulations passed at City Council this year when we got our new development regulations that are currently being gazetted by the province. So they're not formally adopted yet, but they've been adopted in principle by St. John City Council. And Jess was instrumental in making that happen. So tiny homes and alternative dwellings of different sizes. She's also involved in municipal climate change advisory roles throughout the province, so works with small communities and large communities alike to help them figure out their infrastructure needs in the face of climate change. So I think she's a really valuable resource as well. And next to her, we have Jack Parsons, who's the founder, the co-founder of K&B Contracting, which is the first contracting company in Newfoundland Labrador to build a net zero home, which is my understanding anyway. So he's a builder, so brings that valuable lens to the conversation as well. So when we talk about what kind of buildings we would like to see, it's really important to have the voice of experience of somebody who's actually built them in the room as well. So I think we've got our large institutional commercial uses, our heritage uses, as well. I forgot to mention Michael's been an avid volunteer with Happy City St. John's and just a vocal supporter of good urban planning throughout the city as well. So then our tiny homes and our net zero homes. So for this panel, I wanted to have a big focus on affordability within, I guess, carbon neutral buildings in general. I don't want a future where energy efficiency means that people can't afford to live in a house, or that even a business can't afford to rent a building. So we want to figure out how it is that we need to build into the future. And my name is Maggie Burton. I'm the St. John City Councillor, representative for urban planning, development, heritage, arts, culture, and youth. So I wear a lot of hats as well. Anyway, let's get started. The first panelist is going to be Sharon Cave.
How do I get my notes though?
Your notes?
Yeah, it just came up.
Do you have? You can just read off that if you'd like.
That's what I was wondering if you can. There's usually a way you can kind of see.
To double the screen. I don't know how to do that.
Do you know how to show your notes on this and not on that?
I don't know. I can ask the tech guy.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Just so you guys don't see all my notes. While Maggie's doing that, I'll just do a little bit more of an introduction to myself. So, like Maggie said, I've been working with LEED certified buildings it's actually been 12 years now. I started in 2007. And before that, I volunteered with the Canada Green Building Council as well. So that's kind of the hat that I'm wearing today, is with regards to the Canada Green Building Council. Throughout my career, I've done 5. We just received actually certification on the 5 projects I was working on. So the last couple that just happened is Marystown. I don't know if you might have heard about that in the news. That just got LEED Gold certification, which was a big step for them for the new YMCA down there. And the Fortis building, which you can probably see from here when the blinds go up, was also another one. And with my other hat, I work at DFO currently. That's not who I'm here representing today at all, but I work with their real property section. And so I'm in charge of doing their kind of sustainable projects for federal government buildings that fall underneath DFOs, which is generally Coast Guard buildings. And the new Coast Guard building actually across the harbor behind me too is also going for LEED Gold. Yeah, so that's just a little bit about me. And I wanted to kind of get into the purpose of the conference, which is decarbonization. And what this presentation will be about today is how buildings play a role in getting us to that goal and getting to the targets that have been set. And in particular, there we go. Yeah. In particular, I know reading through the program that you guys developed, one of the things said about the session goals is kind of what is required with buildings, what is our path to get us there with regards to buildings. So that's kind of the focus of my presentation today. I'm going to touch on LEED, of course, that's kind of my specialty, but another project or another program that Canada Green Building Council also has is called Zero Carbon Building Standard, which is brand new. It just came out in the spring, and they've started to take registrations for that already. So I'm going to touch on that. So that's kind of the two paths to decarbonization that I'm going to address in this. Yeah. And so the title is How Green Buildings Can Solve Our Climate Crisis. It says can solve our climate crisis, but really it's to help solve our climate crisis. It's part of the grand scheme to getting us there with all other industries and sectors. All right, thank you very much. Okay, so just a little bit about who the Green Building Council is. So it's a not-for-profit organization established in 2002. Our vision is to transform built environment leading to a sustainable future. And our mission is to lead and accelerate the transformation to high-performing, healthy green buildings, homes, and communities throughout Canada. And then that would lead to the question, what is a green building? What is considered a green building? So green buildings strive to balance environmental, economic, and social considerations in design, construction, and operation. So those are kind of what we call the three pillars of sustainability: environmental, economic, and social. So it isn't just about the environment. We want to make sure that this makes economic sense and social sense. As you can see here on the screen, conventional buildings versus green buildings, you can kind of see the difference between what makes it green and what a conventional building uses and what a green building can eliminate. So we're talking about energy and water resource efficiency. We're also talking about, which you don't see on the numbers here, occupant comfort and well-being, site development and a community context, and construction and operational economics. And I just kind of wanted to show this. So the Canada Green Building Council is part of the World Green Building Council, and most countries do have a Green Building Council. And they got together in 2015, the UN members, and there was a 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And they came to 17 goals that were important for sustainable development and to get us to the carbon targets that have been set. And as you can see from this slide, basically every one of these, so there's 9 there, so 9 out of 17 sustainable development goals, buildings have an impact on. So this is why they're important. And that leads to this, that the building sector is recognized now globally as a climate change solution, part of the solution. Canada's built environment is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. The numbers that I've been seeing are 35% come from buildings. And because there are so many environmental impacts of buildings, they also offer us a lot of opportunities to reduce those impacts. And this slide kind of just shows, basically this is cost. So this shows that in buildings, which is the first chart there, that we have the most lowest hanging fruit. It's a low cost, so that's where buildings offer us an opportunity. It isn't that we're the biggest creator of greenhouse gas emissions, but we have a lot of those kind of things that we can pick and do at a lower cost than other industries such as agriculture or industry and energy. And what makes building different? Buildings have a long lifespan. They also have very complicated mechanical and electrical systems. And major reinvestments tend to occur every 20 or 40-year intervals. So this is why zero carbon buildings are needed today. We have to start working on it today. If we don't start working on it today, we're never going to meet the targets. Every building leaves a legacy, essentially, for 50, 80, 100 years, depending on the length of time that the building is around. So the impact of buildings in the future means changing how we build them right now. And retrofit is also important, and retrofits do go on currently, but they tend to just kind of replace the systems that they already have. There's not really an upgrading of the systems. So, and I'm going to get, oops, sorry, I skipped one there. So as I said, the path to decarbonization. Basically, that's what the rest of the conversation will be about, and how we get there through two of the programs that the Canada Green Building Council manages. So the first one is LEAD. And this is the one that I have the most experience with. This is what I've been working with for years. Just to start off some basics, LEAD, it stands for Leadership in Environmental and Energy Design. And it is a global rating system. It's in 150 countries, so out of a total of 195 countries in the world, 150 have LEED certified projects, so it is global. It's also voluntary. No one is making you do LEED. Although the governments, sometimes municipal governments, federal and provincial governments sometimes do have it in kind of their standards and what you should do if they build new construction. It's full scope, and it's a multidisciplinary team that comes to it. So you've got architects, engineers, energy modelers, commissioning agents, daylight consultants. It is a full scope. It is a very holistic approach to building green. So what does LEED measure? LEED is broken out into 6 sustainable development categories, first of which is sustainable sites, water efficiency, energy and atmosphere, materials and resources, and indoor environmental quality, innovation, design, and regional priority. So the first 5 that are there are the main categories. In LEED V4, which is the newest version of LEED out, they break sustainable sites into location and linkages and sustainable sites. So each one of these kind of will have credit categories underneath them that people strive to achieve, and it gives you prescriptive and performance pathways to get there. There are 4 levels of certification, from certified up to platinum, depending on the amount of points that you get when you kind of go through your scorecard and which ones you chose to pursue. Certified right now, as it exists, is pretty much standard construction. Like, there isn't kind of no reason not to get there. Platinum is almost close to a net zero, so there's quite a range in what can be available for teams that want to go down the LEED design route. But with each version of LEED, that bar gets getting set higher and higher, and industry kind of then follows and produces, better buildings throughout. This is just this shows basically when, like, older version of LEED is the very first one there, up to kind of a future version of LEED. You can see where present day line is there now. So when you hit platinum, we are almost getting to net zero, but not quite there yet. So we're hoping kind of as we go down through, as we progress, that this will eventually move us up to, when you get to platinum or get higher, even further down, if you're at silver, we hope to be net zero. And this is just kind of an overview of all the registrations that have happened in Canada so far in certifications, what it's done to impact the environment. So you can see there's energy savings, water savings, recycling, because a big part of this is construction waste management, greenhouse gas reduction, and yeah, so you can see also in Atlantic Canada. I know this is another one of those slides that doesn't break Newfoundland out, but I can tell you that within Newfoundland, we've got 31 registered or certified projects currently in Newfoundland. And these are just some kind of, just to give some Atlantic Canada, to give some local content. These are some stats that have kind of what we've done by building green, what we've reduced in Atlantic Canada alone. So you can see there's energy savings, water savings. There's a lot of construction waste that's been diverted from landfills and reused. Also a reduction in greenhouse gases, of course, and an addition of green roofs. So, we can talk about building new buildings to this zero or to LEED and to zero carbon standards, but what about the existing building stock that we have? Because this plays a critical role. So retrofit is critical. We can't build our way out of this climate crisis. So this slide kind of has a lot of dialogue on it, but this just kind of highlights what the roadmaps, initiatives that we can implement for retrofits that are recommended actions to get us to our 30% emission reduction targets. 1 minute. I got a lot more to go through, so sorry. So I'll skim over this. Recommission buildings, undertake deep retrofits. add renewable energy, and fuel switching. So if we do all these, the goal or the estimates are that we'll get 51% carbon reduction. Kind of wanted to touch on this just for a second, that it used to be energy that we all focused on. Now it's kind of switched to carbon and why it's important. And these two buildings here basically show, they're both buildings in Montreal, or in Quebec, sorry. One is on natural gas, which is the one that's the 36 times more, and the other one is on electricity. So it just shows that the carbon emissions that come from different types of fuels do impact these things. So with energy efficiency, these both would look exactly the same, but with carbon emissions, they're quite different. So what is a zero carbon building? So we want to get to a zero carbon balance, which means basically we're not producing any more emissions or we're removing emissions that we're not producing. Adding renewable energy, we're increasing the energy efficiency of the envelope and the mechanical systems, and we're using low carbon materials. So part of this standard is calculating the embodied carbon that is in actually the materials that are used to build the buildings. The Canada Green Buildings Council did a cost study, or making the business case basically to zero carbon buildings before they kind of released a standard to make sure that this was something that was doable. And these were some of the numbers that kind of came out. So I just highlighted the 91% reduction in carbon achieved on-site, which means only 90% was kind of procured off-site through things like purchase of renewable energy credits, which is a path to get you there too. You just kind of do offsets and support renewable development elsewhere. So buildings not built to the zero carbon buildings will require major investments in retrofits of mechanical equipment, ventilation systems, and building envelopes by 2050 to meet these targets. Again, this is calling to action now. We need to start doing this now. And so kind of to tie this up and conclude, these are some recommendations going forward and how we get there. So meet Canada's climate change targets. Invest in providing incentives for energy efficiency, which I think is very important. You know, these retrofits and commissioning cost money, and having incentives there would definitely help out. Invest in net zero buildings, develop net zero buildings. Basically this standard was created. It's the only one in Canada, or sorry, it's the only one in the world actually that's created that relies on carbon as a metric. Strengthen the building performance. This is really important, that's the first thing you want to do is you want to reduce your load on your building. You want to create your very efficient building envelope with, your insulation levels, and then you move on to your mechanical electric system, size those to be as efficient as they can, and then you add renewable energy. And reduce the Government of Canada's Government of Canada's GHG emissions by adopting these high-performance green building standards to help get us to the net zero construction. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All right. So I'm going to call on Jack, if you could go next, and if you could come up here. And the reason we need to use the mic, I guess, is just because people are watching on a live stream as well. So, or I believe they are. Yeah. Okay. Come on up.
Good morning. Thank you. I don't have anything prepared. I just sort of said I'd go and wing it. But my name is Jack Parsons with K&P Contracting. We started our company in 1976. We built the first R2000 home in Newfoundland in 1982, and we continued ever since. And we've done 3 net zero homes, or net zero ready homes. And the issue sort of comes up when you get into a room like this and say that you're talking about decarbonization or energy efficiency, and you always ask the question, or at least I think the question, well, what are you doing? Do you live in a net zero home? If you truly believe in decarbonization or energy efficiency or climate change, well, then do your part, and your part is to walk the talk. Live in a net zero home. Or in the case of heritage, retrofit to the net zero level. And Sharon said in hers, you look at the lead, the way it's progressing. Well, in the residential side of it, we were a bit slower on that. The first time that insulation levels entered into the code was 2012, and before that you didn't have there was no specifications for insulation levels in the code. So we're getting there, but it's a slow progress. And I think the part of the slow progress is that people don't walk the talk, you know, like you're there, you're buying houses or building houses that don't meet. And Jessica's going to be talking about the tiny homes. And if you look at net zero or energy efficiency, the best way to get towards that is to build a home that's just to your size. Don't overbuild. And that's a very positive thing to do. But my key message is that as you leave here and as a true believer in climate change and decarbonization is to walk the talk to people about it and say, yeah, everybody can do their little part. And you know, out in the other session, they're talking about electric cars and stuff like that. Everything helps. But if you can do your part to be able to live in a more efficient house, it's a positive step. But specifically to look at net zero houses, like what is a net zero house? And the reason that we've built net zero ready houses as opposed to net zero is because of cost efficiency. And at the present time in Newfoundland, because of our electricity rates, which are relatively low in comparison, that it's not cost effective yet to be able to look at alternate energy, be it solar or wind and those types of things in a small project like a house. So if you're looking at 10 kilowatts and you look at the cost of installation and the cost of maintaining it, like basically what we would do is look at a life cycle cost analysis of it, and it never goes into green. So you look at it and you say, well, is it worthwhile? Well, if you make allowances for it, which is what we've done, so that it can be added at any time, well, then it makes sense. And that's what a net zero house is. It says that here's how much energy you're using, and you have space enough to add solar or some other kind of alternate energy to it, then you can say that you're net zero ready because your house meets all the envelope requirements and all the mechanical requirements. It's just that it hasn't produced that alternate energy. And really, that's just about cost efficiencies. Like, you know, what's the point of spending money when you're never going to get a return on it? So when you look at a net zero house, overall, it'll give you a return back in simple payback in 5 to 6 years. And if you sort of break it down into little pieces, there's parts of it that goes relatively high, like under slab insulation, for example, probably look at 25 years return on investment. But the thing when you look at the envelope, basically is there for a lifetime. It's not like a mechanical system that needs ongoing cost to maintain. So when you do a life cycle cost analysis on a basement slab, yeah, the payback is out there, but is never require any more investment or any more maintenance. And the same thing then goes for your envelope, which is the ceiling and the walls, and then you got your windows and doors are contained within that as well. The weakness in our system, I guess, is still doors, because doors have a low efficiency. I mean, typically you're buying a door at an R6, and your wall is, to say, the ones that we've done are anywhere from 38 to 42, and your ceilings are 70. So when your doors are down to 6. Even though your windows are a little bit below that, but we've made great strides on windows. I mean, we've gone from what used to be an R2, which is a double glazed window. We bought that up to 3 with low ER gun. Now we're gone up to about a 5.5 R value in windows. So it makes it work. If you just look at windows alone, I mean, it can give you a payback of in the vicinity around 6 to 7 years, depending on the amount of glazing. But when you look at it again, that's something that's going to be there for a lifetime. It's not something that requires cost. So when you look at what we've done in net zero, we've taken heating system costs, which is, you know, a good heating system cost, let's say, is about $20,000. When you look at a net zero house, you can take a lot of that cost and put it into your building envelope, and then because your mechanical system or your heating system now, you can do for under $5,000, which is what we've done in terms of it. So that sort of makes our envelope a little bit more cost efficient, or look at the payback, and makes it much more attractive, because if you build this, you can save some money over here, so put that into the envelope, and that part of it works. So we've done 3, and I think the first one we did probably got the most advertising or most publicity. That was the one we did on Adams Place in Flatrock. And a couple of years ago, we did one in, probably 2 years ago, for a lady with hydro. And like, she works in the environmental department of hydro, but she was one of the people that sort of walked the talk, you know. She believed in this type of a thing, and she came to us, and she had a very sort of design in mind that had a lot of windows and stuff. But you know, we did it, and like, she's tickled pink with it, you know, and she knows she's getting a return on investment, and it's working for her. So it can work, and you know, if everybody sort of walked the talk, I think we can move regulations, you know, and we can also move the whole perception that net zero housing or net zero buildings is the way to go. And you know, like, when you get appraisals done, appraisals are not where they should be as it relates to some of these things. They don't take it into account, because the reason they don't take it into account, because not everybody believes yet that that is worthwhile doing. So if we started to walk that talk, that'll make it happen. And then from a bank's perspective, it's much easier, because now you're saving all of this money on energy efficiency and the operating cost of your house. Well, then you should be able to increase the amount of money that you get in your mortgages. That's not there yet. So all of these things have got to change in order for us to progress to where we're to. So if everybody sort of walked the talk and got on the same language, well, then everything should work. That's about it.
Thank you, Jack. All right, I'm going to call on Jess Puddister to come up next.
Hopefully I can have my notepad up without people seeing it. I don't think you can. Oh, great. Or you can probably do both screens. Look, I can bring this up. Okay, sure. Right here. All right. Slideshow. And can we make that full? Yeah. Oh yeah, so you're gonna click through. Yeah, I'm gonna click through. I thought I'd be able to see my notes at the same time. Can't. It's totally cool.
I always joke I'm the youngest person on Councillor and the most time down in the tech room.
All right, guys, so I'm going to talk about tiny homes. This is the picture, I guess, of me and Tim in front of our tiny house shell that we built. Maybe some of you have seen it in the news. We started building it in 2015. And yeah, a little bit tall. Okay. So the first thing a lot of people ask us is, why are you doing this? It's a really small house. How are you guys gonna not kill each other? Right? To be honest, like, the way that it started, it didn't come from some kind of like environmental justice perspective at the beginning. We were looking at doing some long-term traveling, and we realized it was going to cost a lot of money to store our stuff for a long period of time. And my partner is a journeyman welder, builder, jack of all trades from the Bay. So he was going to build an enclosed trailer to store our stuff while we were away. And then we saw tiny homes on social media, and we were like, damn, if we're going to build an enclosed trailer, why don't we just build a tiny house? Because then we could potentially live in it and maybe even get debt free, and all these things started coming together. We realized we wanted to create an affordable future for ourselves. When I first graduated from university and moved back home, we were renting in an apartment, and I was very much in the mindset, I guess, that we're all set up to be in when we're at that stage of our lives, and when we come from sort of a privileged society that we do come from. We were downtown looking for a house to buy because we liked the walkability, we liked the proximity to communal space, we liked the density, we liked having a mix of different people all together. But we realized pretty quickly that it was going to be tough for us to afford to buy a home in 2013 when we came back. So yeah, so we turned to tiny house as a solution. And I also wanted to kind of highlight, like, taking on a project like this is mind-bending. It's outside the norm. And I did sort of like cross a tipping point at which I decided, like, yes, we can do this. And I think a big part of it was my partner, Tim. He has hands-on skills. I didn't at the time. So the thought of building my own home or participating in the design of my own home seemed like, I didn't think I was capable of that. But getting to know him and his like lack of fear about taking on a project, that really opened up my mind. As did spending time in his hometown in rural Newfoundland. So I come from the city. My parents hired people to fix things. We really, didn't grow up seeing a lot of things being done hands-on, do-it-yourself. But in Southeast Bight, in Placentia Bay, there's about 70 people who live there. You have to take a ferry. There's no one to hire to do work for you, so you got to figure it out yourself. And that has resulted in an incredibly resourceful community that creates solutions based on their needs, and everyone works together to deliver those solutions. So that blew my mind wide open because I never saw that in the city. And then we had a really amazing network that supported us through the process of doing this. I think like building a tiny house, like anything else in our path to decarbonization, it means pushing the status quo. And in order to push the status quo, it's hard to do it without some level of privilege and support from people in your network that not necessarily everybody has. So I really acknowledge the fact that there's been a lot of people in our lives who've made it possible for us to push the status quo in this realm, whether it be, space to start our building, whether it be land to park it on while we're waiting for municipal government, whether it's, someone who let us stay at their place for free while we were building because they believed in our project, that kind of thing. And then, yeah, we just realized that with job security and the real estate market, it just wasn't working for us for a sustainable future. So we just jumped off the deep end and went for it. So digging into my numbers, I did a degree in earth science. My career has been mostly focused in environmental geology and environmental even assessment. And as our previous presenter was talking about, I really wanted to walk the walk. I didn't want to just talk about it. And I realized that my carbon footprint was huge compared to what it should be, I think. So just like a rough calculation, mine was around 13 metric tons of carbon dioxide. I think the Canadian average is somewhere around over 15. So if we want to meet the IPCC, recommendations, we've got to get down to, say, 7.8 by 2030 and then 0 by 2050. So we've really got to start taking active steps in our daily lives to meet these targets. With that said, I think that we can only participate in decarbonization to the extent that affordability will allow all of us to do that. So this is a pie chart of my actual budget. I'm sharing with you like my real life. So I just want to highlight the blue and the orange sections that have popped out. That represents my cost of housing right now. So I do fall in under the 30% affordability level, but like Tim and I are ridiculously frugal to the point where sometimes it's painful. And I also want to highlight that the amount that's left over at the end of every month is about 14%. That's not a whole lot in terms of being able to put money towards a down payment or invest in net zero technology. And when I was unemployed for 7 months, this chart looked a lot different, right? And that's the reality of being a 20-something in Newfoundland right now. Tim and I have both gone through cycles of unemployment. It's really hard to handle, but we want to stay here. So we're just trying to make it work, right? So when we look at, a family that would have been starting out in my boots in 1971, houses have increased in square footage by 61% since that point in time. And if I think about people that I know that were my age in 1971, I don't think that they were harmed by having smaller homes. I think they did just fine. And similarly, the per person square footage that we have inside our homes has increased by 91% since 1971. So if we look at, say, like Tim's grandmother grew up in a 20 by 24 house with 11 people in it. And if you divide that square footage by the number of people, it's less square footage that Tim and I will have in our tiny house. And Tim's grandparents are some of the best people in the world. And I think that, yeah, they weren't harmed by having not a lot of square footage per person. So, yeah, before I jump into this, actually, let's just go back for a second. Once I started going down this rabbit hole, like, remember, I'm a geologist. I'm not an urban planner. I'm not an architect. But when I started jumping into this, it was like going down a rabbit hole. Like, when you start asking yourself questions about why does my life look like this? Why was this choice made? And you realize that you weren't actively participating in any of those choices. Those choices were made by industry, by government, by standards that you don't even know who created. You really start questioning every facet of your life. And then I realized, look, I guess my friends were probably getting kind of sick of it, and they connected me to other friends who were architects and planners who were like willing to chat about that kind of stuff. So I met really incredible people like Grant and Wendy who are in the room today. And, a brilliant planning department in St. John's who gave me lots of insight further than what I could find on the internet. So yeah, not only did I start questioning the variables inside one home, I started questioning the variables of an entire neighborhood. So if we look at a standard neighborhood that we would see, anywhere in North America these days, it kind of looks like this. You'll notice that the design aims to standardize, and that is to reduce the cost for at-scale developments, right? The layout prioritizes vehicles and utilities. Conveniently accessible communal space is the road. We don't hang out on the road. And this design also minimizes walking distance between our mode of transportation, our car, and our dwelling. So if you really start looking at like human behavior and movement, in this kind of setup, we come home from work, we get out of our car, we go to the front door, we stay trapped inside our home all day or all evening, we come back, we get in our car, we go to work. We're not really interacting with a lot of people, right? So comparing that to what we came from just 1 or 2 generations ago, still in living memory, the design of a community like this, instead of standardizing, it's aiming to meet the unique needs of the families who live there. The layout is prioritizing the landscape and natural human movements and behavior. The conveniently accessible communal space is all the interstitial space in between the homes. There's boardwalks, there's walking paths, there's immediately surrounding green space that everyone can access. And this is a walkable community with no day-to-day reliance on cars. So while a lot of people, especially people from my parents' generation, will look back at this picture and, to be blunt, like, they think of poverty when they see this picture, because being real, like, people from my parents' generation and like Tim's parents' generation, they had it pretty tough compared to we did when we were growing up. Tim's parents won't eat rabbit because they ate a lot of it growing up, right? So there's realities around that in terms of our perspectives, but if we dig into it from a design perspective, we can really see like the benefits that people didn't even realize were going on in this kind of setup. So the broader implications of allowing alternative, diverse, and affordable housing options like tiny homes. Let's see if I can get to my right spot in my notes. So first up, we're going to reduce our portion of disposable income spent on housing. So let's see. On average, about 27% of annual income is spent on housing, but for folks who are earning less than $30,000, that jumps up to 50%. And that really limits people's ability to participate in decarbonization, and it also increases our collective reliance on social systems in the government. So if And not even to mention the trap of interest on like standard homes. I just did like a quick search last night on a $300,000 mortgage at 3.5% for 25 years. You're paying $150,000 in interest. So that's like an enormous amount of money that we can avoid largely if we reduce the size of our home largely. So by reducing our collective reliance on social assistance programs, we free up the public purse to focus on decarbonization, right? So like we spend a lot of money in Newfoundland and Labrador, and we need to try and rein back that spending, I think, and the way we carry out our day-to-day lives can really make a difference there. Then we can redirect some of that disposable income to healthy food, for healthcare. Like, to be being really real with you guys, like, I can't afford health insurance right now because of our realities, right? So that can have long-term implications, I think, like on healthcare, as can healthy food, of course. We can spend more money on education, on ethical clothing, and other basic needs that are just going to decrease our, I guess, reliance on the government in some ways. Choosing quality over quantity, that's a huge one. It leads to higher satisfaction and pride, and reduces the need for repairs, replacement, and the time and effort spent on home maintenance. Of course, it's reducing our carbon footprint very directly, and it's supporting mixed socioeconomic neighborhoods. So this one's really big, guys. This is like probably the most important thing that I wanted to point out to you. So let me just see if I can find. So I'm just going to read a little blurb to you. I know I'm like out of time, but the idea of mixed socioeconomic neighborhoods isn't a new one. If you look at St. John's right now, and I'm not picking on St. John's, we're just here right now, but like there's a lot of neighborhoods that really divide people based on socioeconomic lines. And it's not necessarily intentional all the time, it just sometimes happens that way, but sometimes it is intentional. But anyway, a desire to encourage social mix was one driver of Canada's social housing policies until 1992. And at that time, the federal government sort of withdrew from social housing policy sector, and CMHC determined that income-mixed social housing, i.e. co-op housing, subsidized housing, was too expensive and provided no benefit to low-income residents. We've, of course, learned that that's not true. And let's see. Since the 1990s, increasing social mix has been an explicit goal of strategies around the world to decrease spatially concentrated poverty. So we know that like getting people from different socioeconomic backgrounds living together creates a more just society. And I think a more just society is going to really enable decarbonization more than anything else can. I don't really have time. These are some of the barriers to tiny houses that I've encountered. You know, mostly from people in positions of power, but I've heard people say, this isn't Vancouver. I've heard people say, if we allow one, it could turn into a trailer park. I've heard people say, we don't have a problem with yours, but what if someone else does it and it's not as nice? I've heard people say, it's a waste of developable land. I've heard people say, but we need a precedent, right? Political will to be bold and brave in shifting policies isn't necessarily always there, and we need more of it. And the concept that it doesn't fit with neighborhood character is a lie. So if we look at this McMansion, this works out to 5.5 times larger than the Canadian average. My tiny home is 360 square feet. That's exactly 5.5 times smaller than the Canadian average. The top one is okay and permitted and celebrated, and the bottom one, sometimes people in positions of power step back from it because they're concerned about, well, what does that mean about the people who live inside of it, right? So that's kind of it. I'm sorry I took so long.
Thank you, Jess. And I'll just put in a quick plug to read our 10-year affordable housing strategy that the City of St. John's has published in 2018 that Councillor Jameson, who's sitting there with baby Maggie, was very involved with. And also the Housing Needs Assessment Report that just came out this week. Have a look at it on the city's website. both very good documents, give you a bit of a sense of what affordable housing looks like in the city right now, where it needs to go. Last up, we have Michael Philpott. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in this part. Immediately after he's done, we will do a Q&A and then go into the Citizens Assembly just like we did yesterday.
Hi, everyone. Yep, sure. So I don't really have a slideshow, but in lieu of business cards, please accept this humble slide. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thank you for being here. My name is Michael Philpott, and I'm the Heritage NL's Built Heritage Officer. And Heritage NL was until recently known as the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador. We've been around since the 1980s, recognizing, promoting, and assisting in the restoration of some of our most significant buildings. So I'm here today to talk to you about the place of heritage in a decarbonized province. And I've tried to organize things into 3 sections on buildings, materials, and ideas. And these represent the opportunities I see for advancing decarbonization through preservation. So our first big opportunity is building reuse. And I'll start with the preservation adage at this point that the greenest building is one that's already built. That's a simplification, of course, when talking about some modern standards. But in saying it, we generally mean that reusing a building preserves the embodied energy within it. So that's all the effort, energy, and carbon that went into building it in the first place. Reusing rather than replacing buildings also avoids demolition emissions, prevents tons of materials from ending up in landfills, and eliminates significant emissions that result from new construction. So Canada's Athena Institute, which are experts in life cycle assessment, and that's a thorough accounting method for climate impacts of materials and products and buildings. They used a model they modeled this concept using 4 Canadian case studies. And in all cases, they found that modestly renovated old buildings performed similarly to a typical new building of the same specifications, and that reusing rather than replacing these buildings eliminated or avoided between 185 and 3,500 tons of CO2 equivalent each. Other studies have shown that more efficient replacement homes and offices can take, depending on efficiencies, 25 to 50 years to make up the climate cost of their construction through reduced energy use. And unfortunately, demolition before that point is not uncommon, usually for market rather than functional reasons. I also want to note that many existing and historic buildings have been brought up to standards like LEED and even net zero. And I'll note that today, according to Natural Resources Canada, or at least as of their last study in 2013, I think, that pre-1920s commercial and institutional buildings actually are the least energy dense of our existing building stock. So I was surprised by that myself, so I'll just say it again. So on average, a building built before 1920, commercial or institutional, uses less energy per meter squared than any other age category. And at that point, post-2000 buildings actually use the most. So from the get-go, existing and historic buildings have an advantage in that they exist. But what does the potential look like in Newfoundland and Labrador? Part of our work at Heritage NL is inventorying the province's historic building stock. So in the mid-2000s, we recorded around 90 surviving historic lodge buildings. So that's Masonic, SUF, Orange Order. We also have an inventory of more than 700 church buildings, more entries for merchant and industrial structures. And many of these are underused or even vacant, and many more will be in the next few years. And despite hundreds of these public scale buildings sitting across rural Newfoundland and Labrador, we continue to see buildings of similar scale built, and these already built buildings left empty. So I'm asking you to imagine the potential in retrofitting these buildings for modern uses. Think of the skills in energy assessment and retrofit and maintenance we could be building, and think of the layers of cultural, social, and historic value we could be giving our community centers and theaters and businesses. And demographically speaking, most of our communities don't need more buildings. They need buildings that work for them, and I think adapting existing buildings is a huge opportunity for sustainable and meaningful infrastructure building. So the second heading was materials, and the opportunity I see is in the conservation, use, and reuse of heritage materials. So this may be the most controversial thing I say today, but if you have them, you can keep your old wood windows. They can be drafty or painted shut, but I'm here to tell you that they don't actually have to be. Multiple studies have shown that wood windows in good repair, and that's key because they can be repaired, with one or more energy-saving retrofits, are as efficient as standard double glazed vinyl windows, and that's not getting into high efficiency triple glazed windows, but there are additional retrofits. Other studies have demonstrated that typical replacement windows do not pay for themselves over their useful life. And while window replacement is often one of the first things we do in the name of efficiency, it's actually one of the last we should be doing in terms of impact. So, of course, roof and wall insulation and foundation insulation has a much higher impact. So there's also opportunity more generally in the modern use of traditional materials. So clapboard, for instance, is durable and it's wind resistant, and it's made from local trees and local mills today. Wood's renewable if harvested sustainably. It sequesters carbon as it grows and continues to sequester it while it's in use. It's recyclable, and at the end of its life, mostly biodegradable. Traditional linseed oil paints have actually been making a surprising comeback thanks to some European makers, and they have promises of longer life and no peeling, which is a major problem in some buildings. And our province actually has a surprisingly active trade in new wood windows, which according to the University of Bath's inventory of carbon and energy result in just 10 to 20% of the emissions in manufacturing than an equivalent vinyl window. Lastly, on materials, I want to talk reuse. So we have a long tradition in Newfoundland and Labrador of repurposing building materials. Yet today, salvage is rare and usually unorganized. Meanwhile, cities like Portland, Oregon and Vancouver, BC have instituted deconstruction ordinances requiring buildings be dismantled and recycled rather than demolished. So reducing building material like this, it reduces waste, it creates jobs, and it conserves valuable materials and resources like old growth wood. My last heritage-based opportunity for decarbonization is in the realm of ideas, and there are actually three I'd like to put out there. The first is old building patterns, and Jess alluded to this. So in St. John's, for instance, our historic urban core is defined by the row house, and this form has built-in efficiencies. For one, living in densely built housing concentrates people around jobs, businesses, schools, services like transit, which can reduce emissions more broadly. And most of these houses are attached or semi-detached, which also means a lower heating load in the winter. You're sharing the load with your neighbor, essentially. With about half of our downtown, or close to, dedicated to parking still, there's huge potential to fill in and further densify these existing neighborhoods. The second idea is maintenance. Historically, maintenance was not really a choice, but a survival mechanism in our province. And when low maintenance, usually oil-based materials came along, we embraced them. But today we know the external costs of this switch were not well accounted for, and we're dealing with a lot of that today. So I think there's an opportunity to foster a new maintenance ethic that invests more in people and their skills than in imported and proprietary products. This works heavy on labor and light on materials and keeps more money in the local economy and fosters a skilled labor force. The third and last idea is the vernacular. So in architecture, vernacular buildings are those whose forms and styles arise out of local needs, so social and environmental. With imported products, we also import building styles that don't necessarily respond to our context. By bringing this up, I guess I'm really arguing for a new way of building in our province that marries our traditions with modern building practices to create architecture that reflects this place. So this could involve using old materials in new ways, looking to traditional forms that might provide advantages in our climate, or changing the way we detail a building to suit our specific weather patterns. It might surprise you to learn that conservationists are interested in buildings that aren't built yet, but here we are. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with are some of the challenges we deal with in the field, and hoping that you might have some solutions for us here today. So we experience a skills shortage in both practical restoration and the building science necessary to adapt a wide range of existing buildings, and especially using things like alternate code compliance. And I'm talking both, very old wood buildings, but there's also modern period buildings that are very different, built of concrete and glass and steel and etc. We have a system that associates urban expansion and new construction with economic health, usually without accounting for its consequences. We have a stock of buildings with no consistent accessibility standards. And this is a challenge I don't want to shy away from, but it's one I think we can meet. And we have modern planning practices that inhibit traditional building patterns in most areas. So that includes both the dense downtown urban style and more informal patterns outside the city. So that's all I have. I look forward to seeing what we come up with here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. So take 2 minutes to, or maybe like 1 or 2 minutes, we'll see, to peer review a question if you have one with somebody next to you. That worked really well yesterday. Just a reminder that question should end with a question mark and not be a comment. So start now. Okay, in the interest of time, I think we should move on to asking a couple questions now. So put your hand up if you have one, and we'll get going from there. Elise.
Check. Hi, folks. First of all, thank you so much for everybody's presentations. They were certainly eye-opening, and I think a lot of folks at this table are ready to hit the ground running on a lot of these things. So our question is, if you could each choose one way for to make carbon zero or net zero building accessible to more people, what would it be? Recognizing Jeff's message, the privilege that comes with going carbon neutral. If you do not have the money to do so, if you have a lot of external barriers, especially with the oppressions that a lot of folks face in this province. So what's one attainable way that you think you could make carbon neutral building more accessible?
I'll go first in that if we're talking about houses, I mean. Oh, okay. No, it's just do it. because when you look at the cost benefit analysis, it puts money in your pocket. It'll actually put money in your pocket the first month that you live in the house. Yeah, your mortgage payment may go up a little bit, but your overall cost on a monthly basis will go down. So change the mindset and just do it. And again, not to speak for Jessica, but reduce the size of the house down to be able to say, okay, look, I was going to build 1,284 square feet, go down to 1,020, or you could even go lower. The money that you'll save there, you're putting it into the efficiency, and every month you're saving money. You're putting more money in your pocket to be able to do things that need to be done.
I think the most important thing is to become engaged in local politics, to be super honest. And to question, like, look at your life and what you're doing and what all your choices are, and ask yourself, why is it that way? And if you can't answer the question, chances are it could probably change. And then once you become involved, like, you know, speak to your local politicians. They're people, like they're really nice people in a lot of cases. and show them why you want change, right? There's no need for us to have a minimum dwelling size. It's not in the building code, so it shouldn't be in the development regulations either.
Good question. One thing that's been very effective on the preservation front, and this isn't specifically tied to emissions, but in the United States, for a long time they've offered tax incentives for appropriate restoration and reuse of heritage buildings. And this really gets at the market side of things. Like if you can make it economic for a developer to choose it, you don't even need the end consumer to demand it. They'll do it if it makes economic sense. So I think a similar program that incorporates you know, emissions reductions and different environmental standards would be very effective.
Yeah, good question, and I kind of agree with everything that everyone said too, but you know, the affordability of it is important to, I'm sure, a lot of people, so I think that incentives would help. Also, like, I mean, obviously everything is, you know, downsizing. We don't need as much space, like Jess talked about too. So keeping things smaller and more sustainable as they are, but maybe perhaps incentives that can help people get to that step to do the kind of work that needs to be done to get them on the path to net zero.
Hi, everyone. Really insightful presentations. Thank you so much. Sharon, Michael, and Jack, you talked about how important retrofits are to existing buildings instead of just having to build new. And Jack, you talked about needing to take responsibility and, you know, update your homes to make them more energy efficient, net zero if possible. But Jessica, you talked about how that can be really difficult because people are really stretched financially, right? It can be really difficult for people to afford to do that. So some of these more radical, I guess, environmental proposals like a Green New Deal, like the NDP and Green Climate Change plans are now talking about national energy retrofit programs funded by the government that wouldn't just be tax breaks, but like actually paying to get all these buildings retrofitted. Do you think that's something we should be looking at doing? Because as Sharon, as you mentioned, retrofits are, and like changing buildings are the low-hanging fruit and kind of the cheapest thing that we could do.
Yeah, so I think it's incredibly important. Like I said, the existing building stock that we have now is, you know, it's not going anywhere, and so we need to make change in that sector right now to kind of prevent, you know, or to kind of get us to the point that we need to be with our targets. So yeah, I definitely think it's incredibly important to focus on existing buildings and not just on new construction.
I'm going to tie it to my last comment. So actually just in the last 2 years, there was actually a federal bill put forward by a conservative member actually for a tax credit similar to the American tax credit for historic and existing buildings, which unfortunately died, I think, after a committee and didn't get put into the budget process. But we advocated for that from our position, and yes, we'd be very supportive of leadership on the federal and provincial levels on retrofitting existing buildings.
It's interesting because Michael made the comment in his presentation that existing windows don't give you a return on investment and other things do. And Yet replacing windows is one of the top renovation projects we do. And why is that? Well, it's basically because people are not planning, they're not thinking, they're just doing what everybody else is doing. And that's what we need to do, because Michael's comment is perfectly true. We've done an analysis on it, and when you look at replacing windows, if they're perfectly good shape, you're probably looking at an endless time before you get your money back. There's a lot of work being done, like people replacing siding. Well, if you're replacing your siding and if you add insulation to the outside and add, first of all, you got to add that air barrier, then your insulation, then your weather barrier, and then your siding. Well, it makes sense, but to put the insulation on and not needing to do siding doesn't make sense. So in a retrofit situation, what's really, really important is proper planning, to be able to look at it and look at it in sequence and be able to say, well, I don't need my windows replaced, but I do need maintenance on my siding, or I do need to replace the siding, but then plan something into it. So if you bring the plan together, and if you're into an old house, look at a 10-year plan, not just a 1 or a 2. Look at a 10-year plan. Here's what needs to be done, then you can factor it in, and it'll work.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of what you just said too, it's a mindset change. You know, it's not doing what we've always done. It's looking at things differently and just coming up with different solutions. And yeah, so it's just not sticking with the status quo.
Hi. I have a question specific to retrofitting with a personal interest in it, because we're in the middle of renovating a house downtown and putting new insulation and siding and all that. And I was struck, Jack, by your mentioning of appraisals, and which brings up issues around financial institutions, in particular, because one of the challenges that we've had is in some of the things that we want to do, the bank won't recognize the value of it. And so some things that we might want to do, we can't do because we don't have the cash flow. And the bank will only give you, I think, something like 80% of the value of your house if you're doing sort of major renovations. So I was just wondering if you guys had ideas or thoughts on how financial institutions might change, or if you have had positive experience with particular financial institutions that are more open to recognizing some changes that maybe don't have immediate return on investment, but over the long term have a more sustainable impact.
I'll leave that to Jessica, because you're an advocate of change and getting out there in the community, because that's what it's about. It's about getting out there and sort of, walking the talk, but also talking to appraisers, because it really comes back to, you look at an appraiser, how they do their job. They look at what the market would pay for that house, or what the market would pay for it after the retrofit. So if we all get out there and talk about it, we can affect change, and we have to be able to talk to banks and financial institutions to value of this. But it do get to be difficult, but I'd still encourage you to do a long-term plan, even if you can't get everything done, just do the long-term plan, but do what Jessica said, be an advocate.
Be an advocate. I totally feel you. We've definitely had struggles with financial institutions as well in our journey to try and live in a tiny home. You can't get a mortgage to buy vacant land, so we either take out a personal loan at a much higher interest rate to buy land, and putting sweat equity into your own home isn't always necessarily recognized by the banks either in order to get a construction mortgage. So I feel you. But from what I've heard, maybe talk to the credit union. They seem to be like pretty open, and I know like they're supporting co-housing in some cases. Wendy can speak to it more, but they have an ad, I guess, supporting co-housing. Yeah. 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 I'll leave it at that.
So we're gonna move on to the citizens assembly portion, because we're running out of time. After